you hear me now? Okay, good. Good morning, and thank you for taking the time to be with us today as we learn a little bit more about the story of Sligo and Mount Zion Methodist Episcopal Church. I especially want to say thank you to this church community for the ways that you have allowed me to spend so much of my professional time doing this work. It's been 30 hours a week, really since the end of October, beginning of November, in and of itself. And we'll see as we move through the presentation that has been time that has had exponential impact for our community. So thank you for your investment of your willingness to help me invest my time, and for the ways that we're working to understand this story together. As we begin, I want to start by showing us a picture of Mount Zion circa 1942. And what I'll do here, let's see, is right here you see Georgia Avenue as it existed prior to the widening that resulted in the road that we know today. And here you'll see what is now called Seminary Place Road. It used to be called Brookville Road. And you'll notice that the church sits approximately 15 feet away from that corner. Today, the air shaft for the metro, which we might know exists where the Aldi is today, sits approximately in the center of this building. So to help us begin to get our bearings and understanding how the topography of the site has changed, and we'll walk back through that again here in a second, I wanted us to start by seeing an image of Mount Zion in its most recent form. The title of today's presentation is Erasure and Resiliency. Part of what I'm attempting to do is to provide us not simply a historical analysis of events that have happened in the past, but a theological and I think spiritual framework in which to understand both what has happened and what we're continuing to do as we work together to understand the full story of this community, which is the progenitor of our community. And so before I say anything else, or before I open us in prayer, let me simply say that the story of Silver Spring and the story of Mount Zion is the same story. We come from the same place. We're cut from the same cloth. And whether or not we have any conscious memory of the people who called that worshiping community home, the DNA that was laid down in the founding of that church continues to live on in various ways in this community we call our own. Important thing to remember as we move through today. So let's pause and pray, and then we'll move into our presentation. Lord God, we bless you and we praise you for here and now. You give us the opportunity to be truth tellers and chain breakers, to shatter the fetters of falsity that obscure the pain of our past, and to remember with joy the resiliency of those who resisted even when evil, injustice, and oppression sought to erase them. We pray today, God, that you would make us better stewards of this story than those who've come before us. And help us, we pray, liberated from the lies we've been told, to find fresh strength in the stories of these ancestors. Empower us, we pray, to go forth from this place having learned together to build better, more resilient, beloved community in Silver Spring and beyond. Amen. Two other quick things I'll point out before we move into some of the hermeneutics of erasure and resiliency. I just want to note briefly, this will not be a chronological presentation, and so for those of us who are chronological learners, we'll make the slides available after the fact. There is a brief timeline that is available to the church and that we anticipate having posted on our church website as well. But just know that this is not a chronological presentation, nor is it what some might call a plain truth or factual accounting. And what I mean when I say that is we are telling a story that involves facts from our past, but we're doing so within a larger theological framework of repentance that leads to reparation. And so our goal here is to situate those facts with an understanding of our responsibility in Christian community in response to those facts. So let's talk for a minute about the hermeneutics of erasure and resiliency. Who here knows what the word hermeneutic means that has not gone to seminary? Okay. Okay. One of those fancy cocktail hour words they teach us that simply means the lens through which we understand something. So our hermeneutic is the way that we interpret the things that we've learned, the things that we've been formed by the people and the communities around us, the way we interpret the world, right? And the hermeneutics of erasure and resiliency are really important to understanding the story of Mount Zion. So first of all, let me say that intellectual and theological curiosity sit at the center of being able to engage the lifelong work of repentance. It's not simply enough to acknowledge one bad thing that's happened in the past and then pretend like it's all okay, right? It's that curiosity of understanding, that desire to build and be in better, stronger community that drives that lifelong work, that constant examination that allows us to really live into the kingdom of God as we believe God calls us to. Understanding our history then and our place in it means then that we can't engage in a navel-gazing endeavor, right? Our job is not to just look at what we've done and say, oh, woe is me, oh, look at how bad we were, look at what happened in the past, but rather to begin to embrace the ways that these opportunities to confront the real pain of the past invite us to examine ourselves, to examine our community as a congregation, our broader community as Silver Spring, and begin to live beyond our own limited perspectives and personal vantage points, which means kind of checking some of that unconscious bias that we carry with us. The work that we're engaged in around Mount Zion then is really and truly not possible without this framework, because it's one thing to tell the story of the past, but the story of the past as it's recorded, as we'll find, is not factual, because it was written down by dominant powers that had the ability to erase the stories and legacy of minority communities. And the work of reparation, right? These moments invite us into an opportunity to envision different community, and so even as we are literally uncovering the past, we're being invited to envision a different future. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean when I say erasure and resiliency. Erasure, as I understand it, is a tactic employed by empire, and by empire I mean dominant systems, structures, and institutions that work to destabilize and erase communities that challenge their authority. We see this happening with Rome and minority communities, where Rome would kind of ride in and supposedly save the day, only to begin to culturally appropriate those communities' religious and spiritual traditions in ways that made them subservient to or dependent on Rome. We see this happening in the Babylonian captivity of Scripture, where Babylon rides in. They take away all the intellectuals, all the teachers, all the political leaders. They leave them in exile, and they abandon everybody else, right? These dominant systems are designed to disenfranchise minority communities from their past, from their ancestors, and from the traditions that give them a sense of self that is stronger than the forces outside of them. Resiliency, then, is all of the ways, and as Christians we believe that this is work that's empowered by the Holy Spirit, that these communities under pressure, be they minority communities or communities under attack, find ways not only to survive, survival is not the only point, but ways to thrive even as there are dominant forces attempting to erase them. So we can find a number of examples of this across the scope of time. Modern examples might include the movement that became the United Methodist Women, which was in and of itself a justice movement that was meant to empower women to speak and to lead in the church before the church was willing to allow them to speak and lead. It's things like the Pride Parade that we see occurring first at Stonewall, where LGBTQIA people came together to form resilient communities in the face of dominant erasure. We see its example in things like hush harbors. Are we familiar with hush harbors? Spaces where enslaved persons would go after they were forced to worship in white-led communities to undo what they were hearing from the preachers and the teachers who were using their faith to justify their slavery. All of these are ways that communities practice resiliency. And what we'll find throughout the story of Mount Zion and Sligo is this tension between erasure and resiliency resiliency that has led us to this moment. I want to speak for a moment about the concept of black joy in particular. As I've been reminded by the descendant community, this is a powerful way that we can begin to understand how communities find resiliency in the face of erasure. Are we familiar with the concept of black joy, the intellectual concept? Okay, so Elaine Nichols, who is a supervisory curator at the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, argues that resiliency is rooted in the practice of joy which subverts the dominant narratives of erasure. Another leading African American person in the museum, Brandy Factory, who's also the founder of Upset Homegirls, describes black joy this way. She says, "Black joy affirms that I am not a victim, despite those who try to victimize me, that I am an agent of change, despite those who seek to disempower me, and I will reject the idea that violence, injustice, discrimination, prejudice, and dominance over others are normal," right? So denormalizing the idea of dominance as the center of power, or acceptable. So even when the dominant culture makes it acceptable to erase other people, ignore other people, or practice dominance, I will refuse to reject that. Cleaver Cruz, who founded the Black Joy Project, also says that black joy is not dismissing or creating an alternative black narrative that ignores the realities of our collective pain, right? So joy is not about burying your head in the sand and pretending like it's all going to be okay. Joy, instead, is about holding the pain and injustice in tension with the things that bring joy in our everyday lives. It's about using joy as an entry into understanding the oppressive forces we navigate so that we can begin to re-envision and imagine and create a world free of them. So joy becomes the vehicle by which we begin to envision a different world, right? Reconciliation and reparation are rooted in the practice of joy, refusing to allow the pain of the past, the brokenness of the past, to define what is possible. So with all that in mind, why are we telling the story of Sligo and Mount Zion? Well, certainly here at Silver Spring, it's important because it's a part of our history. But it's an important story to tell regardless of our own historical connection. And it's not simply about understanding the past. As far as this story goes, it is not new in Montgomery County. There are at least 14 African American cemeteries that have been desecrated or improperly removed or remediated or paved over in our county alone. They number among hundreds all across our country that particularly in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s were intentionally removed or erased to allow for the redevelopment of properties primarily for white use. What happened on the corner of Seminary Place and Georgia Avenue has happened countless times, and the self-segregating theologies that justified it are all too common still in the church today. As an example, at the turn of the century, how many African American or black churches do you think existed in Montgomery County at the turn of the 20th century? Shout out a number. Well, you can see it there, 120. Pretend you can't see the slide, Marilyn, you're cheating. There were 120. We forget that at the eve of the Civil War, 50% of the residents of Montgomery County were either freed or enslaved black persons, right? By the turn of the 20th century, that number was less than 30%. By 1960, it was less than 20%. By 1980, it was less than 10%. So while we like to celebrate the fact that we are a progressive, inclusive county here in Montgomery County, the numbers tell a different story, and the history tells a different story too. For us, telling the story is about exercising what I call demonic powers and principalities like racism and classism that shape our past, not just the past of the county, but the past of this community, as we'll begin to understand, so that they don't define our future. And it's about beginning to discern the way that God is calling us, as we read about in the story of Joseph, to take that which people previously intended for evil so that it can be used for good. So let's begin to dive a little bit into the history. Sligo Methodist Episcopal Church was founded on the corner of what is now Seminary Place and Georgia Avenue on December 7th, 1825, so 200 years ago last December. It was established both as a church and as a school, which was a very common practice for Methodist communities of the era. And it named, the deed, which was deeded from the family of Richard Ross, names Richard Ross, Thomas Giddings, Thomas Noble Wilson, Erasmus Perry, Thomas J. Bell, Isaac Williams, and Martin F. Higgins as trustees. Now here's why that's important. The Giddings, Wilson, Perry, and Higgins family continued to worship here at Woodside United Methodist Church well into the 70s. At the time of the church's founding, they held between them 123 enslaved persons. By the eve of the Civil War, that number had doubled. So we're talking about trustees who themselves were enslaved to a system of enslavement. Again, remember that at the eve of the Civil War, enslaved persons and freed black persons made up about 45, almost 50% of the county's population. At least 1/3 of the households enslaved people. And part of the reason this is important is to understand that from the beginning, this racially integrated, theologically segregated community lived within the broader tension of enslavement in our county and in our world. Now, not unlike many other denominations, Methodism operated by this era with a kind of segregated integration. If you know anything about the history of the Methodist Church, you'll know that our founder himself, John Wesley, was an abolitionist and insisted that the early American church, which was founded in Baltimore at the turn of the 1800s, remain abolitionist. However, by the early 18-teens, the church began to slowly walk back its commitments to abolition. So that by 1825, many of our church buildings were being built with segregated seating. At Sligo Mount Zion, the oral history is that black church members were consigned to the back 3 rows of the church and were forced to worship outside the building regardless of the weather if white worshipers filled the space up. In other churches, there were sometimes what were called slave galleries. I know Pastor Martha served at a church with one of those, which were often very unsafe spaces away from the primary seating in a worshiping space where black members were forced to sit. Very quickly, as we then begin to try to understand some of the space, what you are looking at here is the Aldi building. So we know the Aldi building just north of us, right? You'll see the Aldi parking lot. Here is Seminary Place and Georgia Avenue. This is the Montgomery Hills Car Wash. This space, according to modern GIS, is the property that was deeded to those early trustees. However, we have come to know, and we'll get to this at the end of the presentation, that the property occupied by the church and the cemetery was much, much larger, and that the church was the only thing that occupied this corner until 1868. So when you look at that original church building, this is where the 1916 building sat. We'll see through archaeological data that we think that from 1868 to 1875, the church building sat here, but it originally sat about right here, which far exceeds the boundaries of the 1968 cemetery that we come to know as part of the road work that's underway. What's also important to know about this era of formation is that burials on the site would have likely begun shortly after the church was established. It would have been the second oldest Protestant burial ground in the county, with the oldest being Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church Cemetery, which was an African-American cemetery. This, unlike Sharp Street, would have been an integrated burial ground. And so its only other close competitor would have been the Catholic cemetery at St. John's just north of us. The cemetery at Grace isn't founded until the 1860s. Based upon current archaeological research, we now have confirmed that the bounds of the cemetery far exceed the bounds that you can see in these blue lines here. And based on that data, future GPR work is planned. It's currently scheduled to begin in 2 weeks that will take into account a much larger framework. We now believe it's possible burials could have extended all the way back to the modern water tower that occupies the site and as far north as the townhomes that occupy the site. A little bit of Methodist history for those of us who don't know our Methodist church history. This early church would have been deeply shaped by the politics of race and racism in the early American Methodist movement. There are a number of schisms that occur both immediately prior to and after the founding of this congregation. So in 1805, the African Union Church splits away to form a black-only denomination. In 1816, the African Methodist Episcopal Church splits away in Philadelphia after black ministers were forced to occupy the balcony by white ministers. And then in 1821, the African Methodist Episcopal Church Zion forms because in the Methodist Episcopal Church, white persons were still assigned to serve black communities. So we weren't, although there are some early examples of black persons being ordained as ministers, they were few and far between, and it was far more common for the denomination to send white leaders to serve black communities. So the Methodist Episcopal Church Zion specifically focused on ordaining black leaders to serve black communities. These tensions really culminate in 1844 at the General Conference when Bishop James O. Andrew of Georgia was told to desist from the exercise of his episcopal office until he freed the slaves that he had inherited from his wife. And what happens is the representatives of Southern churches exit the General Conference en masse. They form their own denomination that they call the Methodist Episcopal Church South. And from 1844 to 1855, there's a legal battle that begins to boil between the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South. That gets settled in 1855 by the Supreme Court, who rules that the Methodist Episcopal Church South, I'm just going to say ME South from now on so that I'm not getting caught up in any word soup, so that the ME South receives official authority to form, and the resultant left behind community becomes the Methodist Episcopal Church North. This is going to be important in a minute, so hold that in the back of your heads. Now, the other interesting thing to note is that this church also served as a school. Again, not uncommon in the Methodist movement. Sunday schools, which we now think about as, learning about the Bible, had nothing to do with the Bible in the early Methodist movement, at least very little. It was an opportunity for churches to invest in the education of persons who traditionally had to work during the week. And so people would come and they would learn to read, and they would learn arithmetic, and they would learn logic and philosophy as a way to empower those communities. We don't know if this early church served as a school for persons of color. There are no written records, and again, that's part of this erasure stuff that we're going to get at. But it was not uncommon for both black and white persons to gather in separate Sunday schools in a single building. If that's the case, this makes this the oldest school in this portion of the county as well. So this would have been the very first school serving this portion of Montgomery County. Let's talk a little bit about resiliency in the community, particularly through the lens of someone who was a member of Sligo Mount Zion. So who here has heard of Littonsville? And who knows where Littonsville came from? Some of us do. Some of us do. So early black communities were profoundly resilient, even in counties like ours where enslavement was the order of the day. And oftentimes these communities formed themselves around schools and around churches. In 1853, a freed black laborer who worked for the Blair family married a woman named Phyllis that the Blairs had brought with them as an enslaved person from Kentucky, and purchased 4 acres that eventually became the Littonsville we know today. This makes this the oldest African-American neighborhood established in the state and the 3rd oldest in the country. So Samuel purchases these 4 acres. He uses his land wealth to establish this thriving community of people that housed a school, a dance hall, multiple churches, and a 2-room schoolhouse by the 1890s. Now, Samuel maintained ownership of much of this parcel throughout his life, but when he died, because Phyllis never had the opportunity to learn the ability to read or write, white land developers came in, tricked her into signing a mortgage on the property that she did not realize she was signing, and then used that mortgage to take the property away from her. Phyllis, who was also a member of the church and who was buried in the cemetery, died destitute because of the work of communities to try and erase her. Now, 1 acre of this property was sold to George and Mary Washington. Their granddaughter, Paulette, has been working with us as a part of the descendant community. The Washingtons' property stayed in their ownership until the 70s. It is the only property in Littonsville that was seized by eminent domain during urban renewal without any kind of remuneration. So if any of us know anything about urban renewal, we'll know that part of what urban renewal did is it came into communities and it promised to redevelop the community and then to give it back to the people who had given their property for redevelopment, right? So there was an urban renewal. We'll talk about urban renewal a little bit more in a minute. There was an urban renewal office in Littonsville in the 60s. They seized this property after intentionally poisoning the groundwater with gas tanks that were dug out of the first gas station that was located adjacent to the Montgomery Hills car wash, and then condemned the property because the water was poisoned and because they refused to send public water to serve the Washingtons' property because they wanted them out. So this is just one example of both resiliency and the pressures of erasure that resilient communities face. So again, the Washingtons and Littons worshipped at Mount Zion. Phyllis, Samuel, and George were all buried there. Prior to 1870, this is the only black church serving Littonsville, Linden, Wheaton, Sligo, Silver Spring. Members came from Darnestown, from Bealsville, from Rockville, and from Prince George's County to worship here, because it was the only place that they were allowed to worship. Moving ahead, I want to just very quickly show us, courtesy of Miss Dawes, a plat of the original property owned by George by Samuel and Phyllis Litton. So you'll see here the B&O Railroad, which itself was an example of erasure. Samuel died fighting the B&O Railroad because they seized this property by eminent domain and used it to divide his property as well as to remove 2 of the wells that fed fresh water to the families there. You'll see this is the original plat. This was all done after the property was seized from Phyllis. And then you'll see in this lower corner an acre owned by George and Mary Washington. So this is the acre very close to Friendship. I think it's Friendly Towers, I think is what the property is called in Littonsville, that the Washingtons owned well into the 70s. Let's talk a little bit about erasure and the pressures of erasure beginning really in 1845. So following the formation of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, which again, remember, formed unofficially in 1844, forms officially in 1855, churches in slaveholding and border states went through a series of really violent schisms. I mean, there were church burnings, there were people showing up on Sunday morning and chasing the pastor out of town, there were people who were attacking people when they tried to come into the church, and church activity in the area really does suggest that Sligo might have been one of these churches where the tensions got violent. We see in 1837 the formation of a church in White Oak, about a mile away from the former Marvin Memorial United Methodist Church, called Mount Pisgah ME Church. It forms first in 1837, but very quickly aligns itself with the Methodist Episcopal Church South. It had no black worshipers and prided itself on that fact. In fact, there's an article from the Montgomery Sentinel in the 1920s in which they really kind of celebrate the fact that they are an all-white community. Mount Pisgah was one of those churches early on that was formed to serve as a counterbalance to Sligo, which, while it remained segregated in its worshiping community, aligned itself with the Methodist Episcopal Church North. So ostensibly supported the rights of black persons, even though it continued to engage in segregationist behavior. That's going to become important later. Hold on to that fact as we begin to understand the forming stories that shaped the way the former Woodside Church understood itself. White-only worshiping communities were still not enough to appease the deep racism in Montgomery County. Again, while about 1/3 of the county's households owned slaves, nearly 90% voted for the presidential candidate in 1850. I don't have this date written down, that's on me. One of the last presidential candidates prior to Lincoln who supported slavery, right? So the support for slavery in the county was significant, even among persons who didn't own persons who were enslaved. Thank you, Marilyn. And it pays to have other, this is a community affair. As I said, it takes a village and a choir and a former like James Buchanan. Yeah. Everybody needs a retired librarian of Congress in their life. Thank you for that, Marilyn. Thank you. So again, many of these churches faced routine acts of violence and burning, often in efforts to intimidate them from engaging in this kind of segregated integration. We know that Sligo burned down at least twice in its history, including one time in the 1850s and early 1860s, and we believe that was in response to the fact that it was a worshiping community for both white and black persons at that time. You'll see on the archaeological map we've seen a second where we think that building sat, and that was part of a larger spate of church burnings. There were 193 churches that burned down in Montgomery County during that time, all right around the same season as the Civil War was concluding. I want to talk for a minute, too, about the way that map making and cartography were ways that dominant forces engaged in erasure. So as we begin to understand the story of Sligo Mount Zion, that work actually goes back to the conversations around affordable housing here. We knew early on that our history told us three things. First, that we were founded in 1873 because a beneficent abolitionist really wanted there to be an abolitionist congregation in downtown Silver Spring. Surprise, that was a lie. And we also knew that there was this story that Methodists prior to that era had worshiped at, quote, an old schoolhouse north of the Sligo community. So what you'll see here is a map from 1865. This is the Bond Martinet map. You can find it at the Library of Congress. So here you'll see Grace Episcopal Church. Here you'll see W.H. Laney's farm. W.H. Laney was married to the daughter of one of the founding trustees of the church. He was a prominent Methodist clergyman who was known for, among other things, walking enslaved persons who attempted to flee during the Pearl escape, which was the largest nonviolent slave escape attempt in the nation, in D.C., walking those persons who were recaptured to the jail prior to their resale. And then if you look very closely right here on what is Brookville Road and what is now Georgia Avenue, a schoolhouse. There's no church listed like there is for Grace Episcopal or for Mount Pisgah, which is right over here, just a school. Now we know that this was an active worshiping community at this time, and yet the map makers had a vested interest in erasing the presence of this community. And they were so effective that in 2023, local historians were convinced that there could never have been a church here, right? So when I was contacting Montgomery History and other groups to ask them about the history of this congregation, they were convinced there was no church on this corner, that it was all made up, all because of a single map. You know, officials leveraged the fact that free and formerly enslaved persons in this era were denied education, and they worked to intentionally destroy or to refuse to record vital information like birthdays and marriage dates. And what this meant is that everything from the location of these resilient communities to the rights that people had to land and property, even to their freedom, were lost. Philip Eaglin, who was represented in your worship guide today, if you didn't get a chance to read that biography, read it. It's fascinating. Philip Eaglin was a member of the U.S. Colored Troops and of Sligo Mount Zion. We're going to learn a little bit more about him in a second, but part of what we'll learn is that because Mr. Eaglin never learned to read or to write, and because his birth dates were inaccurately recorded by census takers, he was denied access to his Civil War pension for almost a decade before he was, because the adjudicator thought he looked too young to be as old as he said that he was. There was no way he could have fought in the Civil War. You know, the other thing that happens too is that there's this emerging confusion over Linden and Littonsville. So Linden, which ostensibly exists on the east side of the B&O Railroad tracks, was a white bedroom community formed primarily following the Civil War as a way for white folks to flee Washington, D.C. as Washington, D.C. became increasingly integrated and black. If you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend the book that we read last spring, and now the name is Chocolate City, A History of Race and Racism in Our Nation's Capital. It's a wonderful book. It digs really deeply into some of that white flight. You know, and this confusion too, part of what happens is that in burial records related to the cemetery, some say Littonsville, some say Linden, some say Sligo, some say Forest Glen, some say Wheaton, some say Prince George's County, but they all record Mount Zion Methodist Episcopal Church, right? This interchangeable nature of information, particularly as it relates to black community, is an example of the ways that white officials worked to erase the history and legacy of individuals. This was also the way that land speculators and white squatters and banks collaborated to disenfranchise black landowners. This is what happened to Phyllis, right? They misrecorded her information. She had no way to verify it. They took her property, and she died in poverty, right? That was a common occurrence. This is one of many, many, many examples in the era. The centralization of white economic wealth and power that happens in this era is directly connected to later urban renewal efforts. Around, 44% of Montgomery County's population was black on the eve of the Civil War. By 1960, that number drops to 3%. Part of that's because white land speculators came in, they purchased all the property that black landowners had purchased, they reclaimed it for themselves, and they condemned black-owned property so that they could seize it when landowners wouldn't sell. I want to talk for just a second about Grace Episcopal Church. And since we're all friends here and we know that they're our colleagues, we are grateful for their ministry. They are directly connected to us. In fact, although their historian doesn't like it when I say it, they are born out of our congregation. So they are a child of Sligo Mount Zion, just like we are. And the formation of Grace actually provides this really interesting window into the complex ways that white communities began to retreat into self-segregated communities as the Civil War approached. Now, the Wilson family in particular are important. The property that this building now occupies, along with the property on the other side of Georgia Avenue, all the way to Four Corners, all the way over to Georgetown, was owned by the Wilsons originally. It was over 1,000 acres of a tobacco plantation that Thomas Noble Wilson inherited from his father Zadok, whose father purchased it from the man who was given it by the crown in the 1600s. The Wilsons owned property in this area well into the 70s when their family line died out or moved away. It's not fully possible to disentangle all of the connections here, but what we do know is that Thomas Noble Wilson is murdered in 1865 on the eve of the Civil War. He's bayoneted to death right across the street, about where that tan brick house sits, where his pigsty was, by Union soldiers who had come up the pike and were attempting to steal a pig. We don't know if his death serves as what leads to the separation between Grace and Sligo. We don't know if, in fact, he had already been having conversations about separating into a separate church. What we do know is that the property occupied by Grace was originally deeded by Thomas's son, Richard, as part of his settling of Thomas's will. Richard, whose house still stands on First Avenue, just adjacent to Pastor Martha's. There's a picket fence around it if you want to go look at it after this. Richard was on the first vestry of Grace Episcopal Church, which met at Sligo Methodist Episcopal Church. So oral histories later tell us that the Episcopalians and the Methodists worshiped together for a significant portion of time between 1865 and the completion of Grace's first building, which, despite their history from the 60s, was finished a decade after when they originally thought it was finished. And their historian has now corrected that misinformation. Now, Richard had many siblings, but he had a son named John Chalmers, who later serves on the vestry at Grace. And here's what's important about John. John is that well-intentioned white abolitionist that we used to tell ourselves founded this congregation. So sometime between 1865 and 1873, John picks his family up, they go down the street to Grace, and then sometime prior to 1870, there's a land dispute between John, who had given property to Grace to build a parsonage, and Richard. John himself was what was called an anti-secessionist. Do we know what that means? He was pro-slavery, supported enslavement of people, but he was an anti-secessionist, meaning he didn't support secession from the Union. So he winds up inadvertently supporting the North, even though he himself owned enslaved persons and believed that slavery was defensible. So sometime between 1865 and 1870, they get into an argument. The Grace, whose rector was the first chaplain of the Confederacy, decides to purchase the property from Richard instead, because Richard is pro-secession, he's pro-enslavement, he's pro all of the things the Confederacy is. So John picks up his tiddlywinks and comes back to Sligo. By 1870, his daughter Rose Wilson Kerr is born, and it's from an oral history that recalls her own memory of the church that we know that this is about the time John came back. There's an oral history that gets recorded in 1835 by a woman named Mary Doolittle Dawson, and she recounts that Rose told her stories of going to the church as a little girl and falling asleep until, and I quote, don't put this on me, falling asleep until the minister awakened her with his loud shouting, causing her to cry, so they had to take her outside. Aren't you glad we preach a little bit differently these days? Dawson also reported that Wilson, her last name later became Kerr, told her this church was first used by white Episcopalians and Methodists before being given to colored people in 1873, which we now know is also a lie. Early minutes of Grace's vestry record their first meeting happened on April 25th, 1863 at Sligo, and we assume that even though there are other competing histories, that it's those early minutes that are our most reliable pinpoint for the connection between Grace and Sligo. So, in 1866, the first of three fires breaks out on the property. That's the fire I mentioned to you earlier, related to that spate of black and integrated church burnings. And then sometime between 1866 and 1873, white members of the church decide to self-segregate. So John deeds a piece of property where the Lee building is now. We know where the Lee building is in downtown, right? To the church. He builds a new church building, and they pick up their tiddlywinks and they move downtown and seemingly abandon their black members in this building that the white trustees still owned in 1873. That's important because the trustees of the black congregation did not take formal ownership of the property until 1908, which means that from 1873 to 1908, the white trustees of Woodside Methodist Episcopal Church continued to have legal authority over that property. And we're going to find out why that's important here in just a second. We're going to skip ahead here. So, 1876 rolls around. It's been 3 years since the white congregation has moved downtown, and suddenly there's a fire at what's called the Old Sligo ME Church, not Mount Zion Church, another example of erasure, situated on the Brookville Pike about 1 mile from Sligo, that was abandoned by the white people 3 years ago and transferred to colored Methodists. It was never actually legally transferred. Again, an example of a white publication misrepresenting the facts. The church burned down on May 25th, and what the article tells us is that there was no insurance on it, and that it was supposed to be the work of an incendiary, meaning it was intentionally set on fire. Now, here's what's interesting. In 1875, about 6 months before this fire, the white trustees of Sligo, still named Sligo downtown, still named Sligo up here, Sligo, the white trustees, take out a fire insurance policy on a building that they say, let's see, where's the language? Its dimensions are 44 by 26 feet, it's covered in wooden shingles, it has a fireplace on the side. Well, don't you know it? We've got pictures of that original building they built downtown, and it's not covered in shingles, and it didn't have a fireplace on the side. But you know what church building did? The church just north of us. And so what it appears happened is that John C. Wilson, the person who built this building downtown, took out a fire insurance policy on the building they still legally owned that their black members were worshiping in, and then it mysteriously burned to the ground. And they didn't receive the benefit of the insurance that was taken out on it. The white congregation benefited from that financial gain instead. What's really interesting to me about this is that part of the early conversation with Van Buren, our sister church that is the remnant congregation from Mount Zion, began because there was oral history that sometime in our past, members of Woodside had burned down Mount Zion. And we were told that happened sometime in the 20th century. So both pastors were laboring under this understanding that there was this mysterious fire, and maybe that's what happened that caused them to move. We now know that's not the case. We never found a record of a 20th century fire. But there was a fire in 76, that was preserved in oral tradition, not written down, no records. This is a reminder to us that when we start talking about a plain truth accounting, we have to take into consideration oral history as well, which sometimes contains more truth than what's written down, because what's written down is written down by the dominant forces. So again, it's not super clear as to the exact date the congregation segregated. Van Buren's history suggests that it was purchased in 1869. We now know that's not true. The white congregation claims to have worshiped there until 1873. We don't know if that's true. There's no transfer deed. What is clear is the church continued in its operation as a school following the departure of its white members. So from 1873, well into the 20th century, it was one of the only schools for formerly enslaved persons and their children in the region. Continued to operate that way until 1925, when Montgomery County came in and began to actually build schools for black children in the area. It is also the second oldest black church cemetery of record in this part of the county. The other one's in Sandy Spring, and it is the only one that is proximal to Sligo. Prior to 1889, when Pilgrim Baptist Church is formed, and in 1892, when Allen Chapel AME is formed. For this reason, we anticipate that the cemetery here would have been a center for community identity and resilience. It was the only place where persons who were enslaved prior to emancipation could have been buried. And we now know that they were likely buried on the site outside the bounds of the known cemetery. We also have from that same oral history I read from earlier the record of a burial in 1875 by the black church community. And so we know that there were active burials on the site at that time. This is just an example to show you some of the other church schools in the area. So you'll see Sandy Spring here, you'll see Mount Zion here. This is another Mount Zion church, Methodist church. They built a school building on their property. This is Sharp Street Methodist Episcopal Church in Sandy Spring. They had a church building on their property. This Norbeck, another Methodist church, had a school building on their property. Poolsville had a school building on their property. All Methodist, all worshiping communities that built schools specifically for formerly enslaved and enslaved persons. I want to quickly, because I think it's important, beyond all of the negativity, just talk a little bit about some of the people that called this community home as a reminder of the really resilient people that worshiped and lived here. So William Philip Eaglin is born in Charles County in 1833. He's christened William Philip Edelin, not Eaglin, Edelin, as a Catholic. Now, he later changes his name to Eaglin for reasons that aren't super clear, perhaps because it sounded close to Edelin, perhaps because that's how it gets recorded in the early census. Philip himself did not know how to read and did not know how to spell his name, as we find out later when he files for his pension in the 1870s. He was enslaved by a man named Francis Posey, who, by the way, later has connections to Woodside. And Posey dies in about 1852 and leaves the inventory of all the persons he'd enslaved to his wife. Philip is listed there at 8 years of age in 1852. If that's his real age, he would have been born in 1844, and already we're beginning to see the ways that communities misrecorded information to try to disenfranchise people. Sometime in 1863, Philip runs away. He flees the Posey's farm, and he decides to go to Baltimore. He changes his name. He adopts an alternate identity so that if people come looking for him, nobody knows who he actually is. And he maintains this alternative identity well into his marriage. He doesn't tell his wife his real name. He doesn't tell his children his real name, because he did not want to be taken back to the Posey's farm. In 1865, he is mustered into the Union Army and becomes part of the U.S. colored troops. He goes on to be one of the very first Union troops to enter Richmond when the Confederacy flees. He was one of the first liberators of Richmond. Later, in 1865, in October, he's mustered out to Brownsville, Texas. Anybody know what happened in 1865 in Brownsville, Texas? Juneteenth, that's right. That's right. The enforcement of the Emancipation Proclamation in the state of Texas. Philip was one of the very first black troops to arrive in Brownsville when this happened. He was one of the very first to be enforcing the Emancipation Proclamation in Texas. He is later named on a deed in 1908 as a trustee of the church. It was under his leadership that the church was able to wrest control of the property from the white trustees. And what's interesting is our historian Julianne found this note in his veterans file. And it's Philip explaining the differences in his name of record. I never knew my name until after the war, when my grandmother told me I was born in 1833. So Philip didn't know when he was born, because everybody was telling him a different time he was born. My christened name was William Philip, but I was a refugee from my old mistress, having left her before emancipation, and I went to work at Giesborough Point. I was told that if I was caught and I answered to the name Philip and acknowledged that my name was Philip, they would take me back. So I changed my name and dropped the Philip so nobody would know who I was. When I enlisted in the Army, I gave them the name William instead for that same reason. So, Mr. Eglin, who is buried at the cemetery site, we believe, is one example of resiliency in community. Let me talk for a second just briefly about Maria Stevenson. Maria Stevenson is the great-great-great-grandmother of descendants that we currently have participating in our conversations. We don't have a picture of Maria. She was born in 1807 in slavery in St. Mary's County. She was somebody who was brought to this country enslaved from the West African slave trade. She was not born into chattel slavery. She was brought into chattel slavery in 1807. She's predeceased by all but 2 of her 17 children. So she has 17 children. They all die prior to the Civil War, except for 2. And census records show her living in Rockville shortly thereafter with her daughter, a woman named Georgiana, who married a man named Frank Gassaway. Now here's what's interesting about Frank and Georgiana. So Maria comes to town. She's got 2 living children. She's got no grandchildren. Georgiana marries Frank. Frank's brother Henson marries a woman named Bertha. Between the 2 of them, they have 42 children, right? 42 children. By the time Maria died in 1912, at 105 years old, she had 29 living grandchildren and 83 great-grandchildren. So to go from almost all of her children dying to descendants as numerous as the stars. And the Gassaways are still many and very active in the community. She's an example of resilience, right? Of resiliency in the face of all of that work of erasure. The final thing I want to show you is actually extant stained glass windows from the 1916 building. These exist at Montgomery History. You'll see if you look closely at them that they are in memory of Mr. Eglin and his wife. These were actually designed by a student at Howard University who was a worshiper at Mount Zion, who received a scholarship from the community to attend Howard. His designs for the stained glass, and there are several pieces of it that still exist, won him a Skowhegan Scholarship for painting and sculpture. And so what happens is this man named Alfred Johnson is able to go on because of his work that was empowered by this scholarship that was given by this congregation to study with some of the nation's leading artists, including Henry Varnum Poor, whose paintings adorn the wall of multiple federal offices, Sidney Simon, who designed the Four Seasons Fountain in New York, if you've ever seen that fountain in New York, and Yasuo Kuniyoshi, who is the first living artist to have a retrospective of their art presented at the Whitney Museum of Art. So this is another example of the way that this faith community, despite all the pressures that it faced, continued to invest in its community and have exponential impact for the people that it touched. So let's move forward to urban renewal. We're going to jump past much of the early 20th century. Before we do that, though, let me just simply say that in 1873, there's one other thing that happens that's of note. When the white community moves downtown and a deed is signed to that building to the trustees there's a second deed signed on the same date to trustees of Friendship Four Corners Methodist Episcopal Church South. That deed, which was transacted between members of Grace and white members of Sligo, is for a congregation that eventually became Marvin Memorial United Methodist Church. So these 2 congregations, Woodside and Marvin, who merged to form our congregation, originally shared a single congregation, Sligo Mount Zion. So as Silver Springs transportation challenges grew in the 20th century, state and local officials really began to embrace a policy of don't ask, don't tell related to burial grounds and faith communities. This is the first step in the kinds of desecration that we see happening on this site. The roadway gets widened in 1949. When it does, there is a map that gets drawn out. I'll show you a picture of that in a second, that clearly indicates that there are burials in the path of the area to be widened, and there is no record on the state's part or any other part of burials being relocated at that time. We believe this is part of the reason that there are extant burials still under the southbound road lanes of Georgia Avenue. That's the example of the first time that state and county officials began to allow the intentional desecration of black burial grounds. So let's see here. You can see here the former building. So this is the 1916 building that we saw, right? You'll see here the cemetery as it relates to the roadway. This is the roadway prior to white. This is the roadway here. This is the sidewalk. You'll see there are graves sitting in the sidewalk. So here, these little, they look like chess pieces almost, right? These are graves. They are in the roadway. And we believe they never got moved. We've got strong indications that they never got moved. This is 1949, and it's the first of two roadway widenings that happen. The other thing that happens in this era is urban renewal. And if we know anything about urban renewal, we'll know that the way that the county went about this is that they would come into areas and first they would install things that would cause damage to the community. They built, for instance, in Littonsville, an incinerator and a dump. There was a coal yard for the trains. There were the train tracks itself, which poisoned the water. They would dump illegal materials in places that they knew served the groundwater that fed these communities. So these gas tanks are an example. There are living descendants who remember walking in the woods and the soles of their shoes beginning to deteriorate because of the levels of chemicals in the soil. And then they would condemn them, right? So one of the things that happened in urban renewal is that the county passed a law that said that any building that did not have indoor plumbing should be condemned. And then they refused to provide public sewer access to Littonsville, so that even if you had indoor plumbing, there was nowhere it could go. And then they condemned all the properties in Littonsville. Right? So that's an example of the ways that planned neglect was used to justify condemnation under the policies of urban renewal. The other thing that happens are these really bizarre and unjust land swap deals. So they would come to someone, they'd say, oh, you know, Carol, you've got this piece of property, we really want to build a school on it. So if you give us this, we'll give you this piece of property over here. And so Carol would say, yes, I think having a school is important for my community. Carol would sign the deed, and they would give her a piece of property valued at less than 20% of the property she had given up. That was half the size, and that was untenable for growing, for building, or for anything else. Right? So these illegal and unjust land swap deals were also used to help force black residents out of the area. As we industrialized these communities, we began to poison people. And so when we look at death certificates in particular of persons we know were buried at the cemetery, the rates of really bizarre cancers, colorectal cancer, cancer of the connective tissues, those kinds of things become the primary way people are dying. They're dying of hemorrhages and heart attacks at 20 and 30. They're dying in industrial accidents on roadways and railways. And it's because this community that they had been living in since the 1850s was redeveloped to be unsafe for habitation. Ultimately, then, this begins to decimate the black population of Littonsville that was worshiping at this church. And so slowly between the 1920s and the 1960s, the use of eminent domain and condemnation drives the population the church is serving back into D.C., back into Prince George's County, farther north into Montgomery County, and worshiping attendance at the church begins to dwindle. So that, facing declining pressure, the church, Mount Zion, chooses to sell the building following the completion of the Beltway. Now this is important. Following the completion of the Beltway in 1964 to the Safeway Corporation. Safeway purchases all of those parcels. They build the Aldi building as we now know it. They then sell smaller parcels that become the car wash and the gas station. They sold that property for $268,000. Now, here's the thing. The year before, The year before the Beltway's done, the year before Georgia Avenue is fully widened, Woodside sold their campus, which sat in downtown Silver Spring, farther away from the Beltway, and therefore in the 1960s of less value, for $1.75 million. The discrepancy in the price says it all, right? The property that they sold, which was approximately the same size as the property we sold, was undervalued intentionally to force them out. At that time, Safeway guaranteed that bodies buried at the cemetery would be moved, and so beginning in late 1964 into 1965, plots were purchased at what is now known as the Maryland National Memorial Park in Laurel. It was known as George Washington Carver Cemetery at the time, and plans are undertaken with Snowden Funeral Home to move those bodies. Following the sale of that property, black members moved to a site in D.C. where they formed Van Buren United Methodist Church. It sits on the corner of Eastern and Van Buren, and most of the church records get lost during this move. So all of the membership records, a lot of the history gets lost. And then, to add insult to injury, during the formation of the United Methodist Church a few years later in 1968, and the merger of our formerly segregated annual conferences, the Baltimore Conference and the Washington Conference, records of our black churches largely disappear. And so still today, historic black churches that did not maintain their own records don't have records because conference records were lost or were destroyed. And this is the point at which Woodside begins to rewrite its story, right? So this is the first time we read a history written by Woodside that says, we didn't exist prior to 1873, we don't know anything about Sligo, we were formed by these really nice abolitionists, and it's also around the same time that the church begins to integrate. So Silver Spring, Woodside, began to do really intentional work around some of its racialized past at this point, but does so at the excuse of not telling the truth about its past. All in all, we now know that 24 bodies were relocated to Maryland National. We've identified 24 both in marked and unmarked graves. That number's up from 6 following a trip out to Maryland National. To date, we've identified 217 burials in the cemetery in the 20th century. So what we know is that from 1900 to 1963, when the last burial happened, there were 217 persons buried at Sligo Mount Zion. We know that in the 30s, there were enough people buried in both marked and unmarked graves at that cemetery site that people began to purchase property elsewhere, because when they would begin to try to open graves, they would inadvertently disturb existing graves, which was very common because not all graves had markers or those kinds of things. We've now come to understand that there could be multiple mass graves related to the site. So when you see the archaeological map in a minute, you'll see that there's a vast swath of the site that is devoid of any kind of burial. It was very common in the 60s, and we now know from somebody who was actually on site performing the exhumations, that they would bring in a backhoe, and they would dig up everything that they knew, everything that was marked, so every person that was marked, and they would bury those individuals that still had caskets in individual graves. But if there were graves that they couldn't identify, or if they ran into remains they couldn't identify, they would put them in the back of a dump truck, and they would carry them away, and they would dump them in a mass grave. We now have identified 157 extant burials. That means burials still on the site today. And large portions of the site seem to have been remediated, but we now are tracking information that there could be mass graves at Ash Memorial Cemetery, where recent oral history has indicated that there is a low-lying plain where graves have been identified, as well as a second mass grave at Union Memorial Cemetery in Sandy Spring, where a neighbor recounts having actually seen individuals and parts of caskets and those kinds of things being dumped in the 1960s. Some of the people still buried on the site, we believe, include Samuel Litton, Philip Eaglin, Maria Stevenson, and all of those people that we've talked about today. So I'm going to ask Pastor Martha to pass out a map of the cemetery site to begin to help us understand where we are today. In November of this year, we were notified, or late October, we were notified of our connection to this site, working with partners at Van Buren, members of the descendant community, local historians, and private property owners. To date, we have conducted ground-penetrating radar surveys of the Aldi parking lot, which is this that you'll see here, of the Montgomery Hills Car Wash, which is this area here, and of what was once the Shell gas station. All of this sits in front of the Seminary Place Shopping Center, where the Aldi is located. Surveys went into Georgia Avenue to take into account the southbound lane, and you'll see that there are burials there. And because of the evidence of burials on the gas station site, and we'll dig into this in just a second, we are now conducting surveys of the rest of the Montgomery Hills, the Seminary Place Shopping Center parking lot and the eastbound lanes of Seminary Place Road, because there is a deep fear now that bodies could be much farther dispersed on the site. As you're looking at that map that you've got, I'm going to invite you to turn it this way so that the white interpretation box is at the bottom. So so you'll see the white interpretation box here. There are 131 possible and probable burials underneath the Aldi parking lot. Probable burials are in pink, and so when you see these little round shapes like this, you are looking at very probable graves. The blue shapes represent what they're calling possible graves. And then you'll see some shapes that look a little odd. So you'll see this big shape kind of right here at the top of this parking deck. You'll see these partial shapes underneath the Aldi building itself. You'll see one here in the road where you can barely see it, but it's right here in this little hash mark that's facing the opposite direction. So when we're interpreting this data, the way that GPR works is that it takes a top-down scan about yay wide and goes in long linear paths across the site. That information is then stitched together, and what it's looking for are disturbances in the soil. Right? So it can detect when the soil in one place is different from another, and it can also detect the presence of metal. So if there are nails, if there are handles, if there's clothing. Given the age of this cemetery site, it's highly likely there were many shroud burials, and what that means is a burial in which a person didn't have a casket or burial container, but were simply wrapped in a winding cloth. There would not likely be metal in those burials, which would explain the number of probable burials that we're seeing. Now, one of the questions is, does a possible burial mean that grave was removed? The answer is maybe, right? We don't know for sure if those have been excavated. However, based on the clustering that you see, we really do think that it's very likely that those probables are all actual remaining burials. In the gas station site here, and this is important too, you see how many burials, there are 32 burials here. This portion of the site from 1868 was someone's home. Someone lived here. There was a tavern here in the 1940s. This tells us that the cemetery was much, much larger and much more full than anybody, including our archaeologists, believed was possible. And that's part of the reason that we're getting ready to do this extra archaeological work. I want to point out these 3 pink blobs that you can see right here. These are gas tanks that are still present on the site. And you'll notice that there are burials adjacent to those. So one of the questions is whether or not we're going to have to respectfully disinter and reinter those persons if those gas tanks have to be removed. One of the things I want to point out about this too is these burials here underneath the Aldi building. These are all possible, and that's enough for the private property owner to refuse any further investigation inside the interior of the building. However, we believe that it's likely because of their presence there that burials do go much farther west. And Becky, I know that's your neighborhood, which is why I'm looking at you. The final thing that I'll point out about all of this is this. There's a profound tension we're living in right now between private property laws in our nation and what's owned by the state. So the state, and what kicked off this whole project, is the state purchased these 2 parcels here for staging for the roadway project that will widen Georgia Avenue, create bike lanes, and generally make that intersection generally safer. When they did, and they found that there was a cemetery there, we began to work together to try to figure out the full picture. What we found has shocked everybody. To date, in Montgomery County, this is the largest cemetery of its kind that's been found, with this many extant burials. There's nothing else to quite compare. And we think some of that's because of the relative state of preservation, because this parking lot, the Aldi parking lot, has been there since 1965, and because this was somebody's home for so long, that there wasn't a lot of excavation or work being done here. The plan then is for those burials that are located in the right-of-way, which is right here, so you'll see there are a number here, there are a number in the roadway, there are a number at the car wash and under the gas station. For those that are not on the gas station site, but are in areas impacted by construction, to respectfully disinter and reinter those individuals, and to reinter them on one of these two parcels, which descendants have requested the state return to their ownership for the creation of a permanent memorial that will tell the story of some of the individuals that we've learned a little bit about today, and provide these ancestors an opportunity to rest as close as they can to the property where they wanted their bodies to rest. Negotiations with the state are ongoing. There's been positive movement there, but there's still much work to be done. And so our continued work as a congregation, because of our shared history, remember this burial ground is our burial ground, as much as it is Van Buren's, as much as it is the descendants, is to ensure the respectful treatment of those remains which we anticipate will remain interred underneath the Aldi parking lot, because private property laws protect the owner from having to do anything. They didn't even have to give us the right to scan the property. And to ensure that the dignity and legacy of those persons who are buried here is preserved, particularly in a moment when our nation is working so hard to erase the history. So I'm happy to answer questions you've got right now and to provide any clarity that might be helpful as we seek to continue this work. Amy? Was the question when or where? Where? So the question from Amy was, where would bodies that might be disinterred be reinterred? And the answer would be on these two parts. So the agreement of the descendants is that we will allow the disinterment of individuals so long as they can be reinterred here. And so this sets up a bit of a sticky wicket, because descendants aren't going to agree to construction of any form on the site or widening of the roadway in any way until these parcels have been given back to the descendants so that their ancestors can be respectfully reinterred.
So on top of that area where you turn to be a memorial,
Yeah. In the case of individuals who may be disinterred from this area, there is the potential, slight, given the history of the site, that DNA testing could be conducted to identify their descendants. The descendants will have to decide if that's something that they want to do. If we do identify folks, they would receive individually marked burials. If we are unable to do so, they would remain in marked burials that simply say unnamed faithful, I think is kind of the general vision right now. Other questions? So here's what I want us to recognize, right? This is not the first time this has happened. It won't be the last. And it's part of the reason it's so important to tell this story. So I want to encourage you to continue to pay attention to information as it's unfolding, as information changes, which it is constantly. Even information in this slide deck is out of date because what we now know has changed from a week ago. And I want to continue to encourage you to show up and listen to the descendants who are going to be sharing the stories of their ancestors with us. It has been such a joy and a profound honor to get to know some of these individuals and their stories and their history. I feel so privileged to have been invited into folks' families as they're sharing these stories. And what's important about this is not the death, but the life. Right? It's the life these individuals led and the life that they continue to live into us as we learn their stories. So take the time to learn their stories. Take the time to show up when you are invited into conversations around this SHA parcel petition. This is a petition to SHA to ask them to return those properties. You can contribute financially to the ongoing research that we are doing on our Give page on our website. We're serving as a financial fiduciary agent for the descendants until a 501c3 can be formed. That's another great way that you can invest in this work.
Who's going to pay for all of that?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
So Amy's second question was, who's going to pay for it all? Who's going to pay for it all? Our congregation has paid into the GPR surveys on the portions of the property that are privately owned, and that total right now is about $25,215. Right. The state is required to perform ground penetrating research on all the properties they own, including the right-of-way and those 2 parcels that we've looked at. Their expense has been much higher, and we've been lucky to be able to kind of glom on to the work that they're doing. Any disinterment or reinterment or subsequent archaeological survey is the state's responsibility to pay for. Any memorial construction is the descendants' responsibility to fundraise for. And so that's where fundraising is going to be important, is as we seek to build that memorial, to tell the full story.
Is there a state statute or a piece of legislation that requires that or mandates that? Or just
The state has the ability to do it. Whether or not they choose to do it's a separate question, but we know that they've received pressure from Governor Moore's office and others to help make this happen. Sylvia? So the question was, as the conference, our annual conference, supporting funding to help offset some of this work? What's that? Or any type of support. So the conference has offered organizing support at the state level. Obviously, the bishop and district superintendent showed up at the reconsecration event that we held in November. They've lent their support in that way. Financial resources are harder to come by. We are in the process of looking into grant programs that may be able to help the descendants offset ongoing costs, particularly as we look at expanded GPR surveys at Ash and at Union Memorial, and potentially at National Memorial Park as we work to identify those unmarked burials there. Drew?
For this information, for people that are not here, how can we direct them to more information?
Mm-hmm. So we've been working on a web page. It's not yet live. That's available. If you will, we'll pass a sign-up sheet around if you'd like to receive a copy of the slide decks, with the understanding that the slides are slightly out of date and that they're going to be more and more out of date as more information comes in. I'm happy to put that in your hands as well as a timeline that actually goes through the kind of date-by-date history. What other questions are there? Okay. Well, thank you for your time today. It's been good to be with you. I hope that you have a safe, rainy Sunday afternoon.